Welcome to Sleepy Nights, a place where imagination and mystery intertwine, guiding you into a world of wonder and rest. As we journey together, let the soothing sound of the rain and the calming rhythm of my voice carry you closer to a peaceful slumber. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue creating these stories that ease your mind and lull you to sleep. Now, settle in, relax, and let your thoughts drift away. I'd lived in my small one-bedroom apartment for almost a year. It wasn't much, but it was home, a place I could unwind after work, binge-watch shows, and enjoy the silence. It was cozy in its own way, tucked on the third floor of an old building with creaky floors and thin walls. For the most part, it was peaceful. I liked my neighbors, the rent was reasonable, and the only thing I ever complained about was the occasional draft that snuck in through the old windows. But everything changed the day I noticed my first missing item. It was a Tuesday, late afternoon. I'd been working on some paperwork at my tiny dining table and left for a moment to grab a glass of water. When I came back, the pen I'd been using, a cheap blue ballpoint, was gone. I checked the floor, the edges of the table, even under the stack of papers. It wasn't anywhere. "Must have rolled off," I muttered, though the table was flat and the pen had no reason to move. I shrugged it off, grabbed another pen, and didn't think about it again. A week later, it was a book. A dog-eared paperback I'd been reading before bed. I distinctly remembered leaving it on my nightstand, but when I reached for it the next evening, it wasn't there. I searched everywhere, under the bed, behind the nightstand, even in the living room, though I hadn't brought it out there. It was just gone. I frowned, annoyed, but unwilling to jump to conclusions. Maybe I'd misplaced it. Maybe it would turn up later. Still, the nagging feeling of something being off lingered in the back of my mind. 2 weeks later, I came home from work to find something on my bed. A journal. It wasn't just any journal. It was mine. I picked it up slowly, my heart racing. I hadn't seen this journal in months. I'd tucked it into a box in my closet after deciding I wasn't much of a diary keeper. Yet here it was, lying on my neatly made bed like someone had deliberately placed it there. I flipped it open, skimming the pages. The handwriting was mine, sloppy cursive, the way I always wrote when I was in a hurry. But the entries, they were dated from months ago, filled with details about things I didn't remember doing. Trips to the park, conversations with friends, errands I didn't recall running. I slammed it shut, my hands trembling. Was I losing my mind? That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the building amplified in the silence. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft clink, like glass against metal. I held my breath, listening. It came again, louder this time. The sound of a mug being set down on a countertop. I sat up, my heart pounding. I lived alone. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. The light was off, but the glow of the street lamp outside spilled through the window, casting eerie shadows on the walls. And there it was, a mug, sitting on the counter. Empty. The next morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd left the mug there and forgotten about it. Maybe the noises were just the building settling. But as the days passed, more strange things happened. I'd wake up to find cabinet doors open, lights turned on, or objects moved from where I'd left them. Once, I came home to find my fridge door ajar, though nothing seemed to be missing. And then there was the shadow. It was late one night, and I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement in the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I stood slowly, every instinct screaming at me to stay where I was. But I forced myself to move, inching toward the hallway. There was nothing there. Desperate for answers, I started setting up small traps. A piece of tape over the closet door, flour sprinkled lightly on the kitchen floor. I needed to prove to myself that no one else was in the apartment. For days, nothing happened. The tape stayed intact, the flour undisturbed. But then, one morning, I woke up to find footprints in the flour. Bare footprints. They didn't belong to me. I couldn't take it anymore. That night, I stayed awake, hiding in the shadows of my living room with a baseball bat in hand. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. The soft creak of a door opening. I held my breath, gripping the bat tightly. The footsteps were light, almost hesitant, as they moved toward the kitchen. I waited until they stopped, then flipped on the light. "Who's there?" I shouted, stepping into the room. The figure standing in front of me was thin, pale, with dark circles under their eyes. "I live here," they said softly. Their name was Marcus, and they'd been living in the crawl space above my apartment for months. They'd found a way in through a vent in the ceiling and had been sneaking around when I wasn't home, or when they thought I was asleep. The journal? They'd found it in my closet and started writing in it to mess with me. The noises, the missing items, the moved objects, it was all Marcus. But what chilled me the most was their reason. "I just didn't want to be alone," they said. The police took Marcus away that night, and I moved out of the apartment a week later. Even now, in my new place, I find myself double-checking the locks, glancing over my shoulder, and listening for sounds in the night. Because sometimes when the house is quiet, I think I hear footsteps that don't belong to me. I first noticed him on a Sunday morning. It was one of those quiet, lazy Sundays where the world seemed to move just a little slower. I was sitting by my kitchen window with a mug of coffee, watching the leaves outside flutter in the breeze. That's when he appeared, my neighbor. He was moving boxes from the back of a dusty van, his movements precise and deliberate. I'd lived in my townhouse for over 5 years, but I couldn't recall ever seeing him before. He wasn't new, though. His garden, overgrown, had signs of long-term neglect, and the paint on his shutters was peeling. Yet I hadn't seen him out mowing the lawn or taking out the trash. Nothing. He wasn't what you'd call memorable. Average height, slim build, graying hair. He wore dark clothes that blended into the shadows. There was nothing remarkable about him, yet I couldn't take my eyes off him. Something about the way he moved, calm, almost rehearsed, set me on edge. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. "You're overthinking again," I muttered to myself. But the feeling lingered. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at my bedroom ceiling, thinking about him. Who was he? Why hadn't I noticed him before? My neighborhood wasn't the kind of place where people stayed strangers. We had barbecues, holiday parties, the occasional book club meeting. I realized I didn't even know his name. The next morning, I made an excuse to leave the house early. I wanted to catch another glimpse of him. Sure enough, his curtains were drawn, his front yard empty. It was as though he didn't exist. It became a habit, checking his house every morning, every evening. I told myself it was a harmless curiosity, that I was just trying to piece together the life of a neighbor I'd never met. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. There was something about him that didn't sit right. It was a week later when I saw him again. It was late, close to midnight, and I'd gone to the kitchen for a glass of water. His house was dark, as always, but as I glanced out the window, I saw a faint glow near the back of his property. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. He was there, crouched in his backyard, a flashlight in one hand and something metallic in the other. I couldn't tell what he was doing, but it looked methodical. He wasn't gardening, and he wasn't fixing anything. He was digging. My breath caught in my throat. What was he burying? Or worse, unearthing? I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but the thought gnawed at me. I stayed up that night, replaying the scene over and over in my head. The next day, I decided to take a walk, hoping to ease my mind. My route conveniently passed by his house. To my surprise, his front door was open, and he was standing in the doorway. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, staring at the street with a blank expression. I slowed my pace, my heart hammering in my chest. Should I say something? A friendly hello? But before I could decide, he turned his head slightly, and our eyes met. His gaze was cold, calculating. I felt like a bug under a magnifying glass. "Morning," I managed to squeak out. He didn't reply. He just stood there, watching me. That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I opened my laptop and typed "missing persons" into the search bar. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but as I scrolled through, I found a cold case from a town not far from ours. A young woman, missing for nearly a decade. The article mentioned she was last seen leaving a party late at night. My stomach turned as I saw the grainy photo attached to the article. In the background, barely visible, was a man. It was him, my neighbor. The realization hit me like a freight train. My neighbor wasn't just strange, he was dangerous. I debated calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I'd seen a man digging in his yard late at night? That I thought he resembled someone in a decade-old photo? It wasn't enough. Instead, I decided to watch him more closely. A few nights later, I saw him again. This time, he was carrying something large and wrapped in a tarp. My blood ran cold as I realized he was heading toward the same spot in his backyard. I grabbed my phone and started filming from my window, my hands shaking. The next morning, I sent the video to the local police anonymously. They didn't respond right away, but a week later, I saw patrol cars outside his house. I watched from my window as they questioned him. He was calm, almost smug, as he spoke to the officers. But then they started digging in his backyard. It wasn't long before they found something, a box. The box contained old photographs, letters, and personal items belonging to the missing woman. My neighbor has been taken into custody, and the police are still digging. The glove was lying there, untouched, as if it had been waiting for someone to notice. The way it rested on the damp grass, fingers curled slightly inward, made it feel alive. It was the smallest detail in an otherwise chaotic scene, but I couldn't look away. The late afternoon sky was overcast, and the smell of rain lingered in the air. The police tape fluttered in the breeze, casting erratic shadows across the ground. I stood just outside the perimeter, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, or maybe what I was feeling. This wasn't my crime scene to investigate. I was a reporter, not a detective. But something about that glove drew me in. It was black leather, worn at the edges, the kind you'd see in an old detective movie. And then, like a whisper from the past, it hit me. I'd seen that glove before. It was over 20 years ago, during one of the first big stories I'd ever covered, a missing persons case that had gripped the entire city. The victim's name was Lily Hart, a 27-year-old artist who had vanished without a trace. The last clue anyone found was a single black glove, discarded in an alleyway near her apartment. That glove had been identical to this one. I felt a shiver creep up my spine as I stood there, staring. Coincidences happen, sure, but this? This felt like something more. The edges of my mind buzzed with fragments of the past. News articles, witness interviews, grainy photographs of Lily's smile. The glove had been the centerpiece of the investigation back then, but it hadn't led anywhere. The detective on the scene caught my eye. He was young, with a face that still carried the weight of idealism. His name tag read, Detective Rourke. "You here for the story?" he asked, motioning to the notepad in my hand. I nodded. "Yeah, hit and run, right?" He squinted at me, then glanced back toward the cordoned-off area. "That's what it looks like, but something doesn't sit right." Victim's ID is missing, no witnesses, and the glove. The glove doesn't belong, I finished for him. Rourke raised an eyebrow. You noticed that too? I hesitated before saying, I think I've seen it before. 20 years ago. Lily Hart. His eyes widened. The cold case? You're saying this is connected? I didn't have an answer, but the feeling in my gut told me it was worth digging deeper. Later that night, I spread old newspapers across my kitchen table. The headline from 20 years ago stared back at me. Young artist vanishes without a trace. Below it was a photo of Lily, her dark hair framing a face that was equal parts hope and mischief. The article detailed her disappearance, focusing heavily on the glove found near her apartment. It had been dismissed as circumstantial, common, mass-produced, impossible to trace. But now, 2 decades later, here was its twin. I leaned back in my chair, the creak of the wood loud in the quiet room. Outside, the wind rustled the leaves, and for a moment, I thought I heard footsteps. I turned toward the window, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. Still, unease settled over me like a heavy blanket. I spent the next day at the library, combing through archives. The details of Lily's case were as frustratingly vague as I remembered. She'd been last seen leaving a gallery opening. Witnesses reported nothing unusual. No strange men lurking, no suspicious vehicles. Just Lily, stepping out into the night and disappearing. The glove was the only clue, but even that had led to nothing. I was about to give up when I found a detail I'd overlooked before. A witness statement from a neighbor who claimed to have heard voices in the alley that night. The report noted that the voices were low, indistinct, but one word had been clear. Run. It wasn't much, but it was something. Detective Rourke called me that evening. We identified the victim from the hit and run, he said. Her name was Grace Adler. I froze. Grace Adler had been Lily's best friend. She was the one who'd reported Lily missing all those years ago. Do you think it's connected? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Rourke admitted, but it feels too coincidental. As I hung up, my mind raced. Grace had been Lily's closest confidant, the one who'd tirelessly pushed for answers when the case went cold. And now, she was gone too, with the same black glove marking the scene. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind outside reminded me of whispers, and every creak of the house felt like footsteps. I sat in my living room, staring at the photograph of Lily and Grace from an old article. They were smiling, arms draped around each other, the kind of bond you could feel just by looking at them. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence. I jumped, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I called out, but there was no response. Slowly, I approached the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stop. When I opened it, the street was empty. But on the porch, lying neatly in the center, was another black glove. I called Rourke immediately, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. "Someone's trying to send a message," he said, "but we need to figure out who." We decided to meet the next morning, but I barely slept. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of Lily standing in the alley, her face pale and her lips moving soundlessly. Behind her, shadows stretched and shifted, forming into shapes that didn't belong. The next day, Rourke and I pored over the evidence together. The gloves, the hit and run, the voices in the alley, it all pointed to someone who had been watching, waiting, and then we found it. Grace's last known address was only 2 blocks from the site of the hit and run. When we searched her apartment, we found a hidden notebook tucked away in the back of a drawer. Inside were pages of frantic handwriting, detailing her suspicions about Lily's disappearance. She believed someone had been following them both. A man Lily had met at a gallery. She didn't have a name, only a description. Dark coat, quiet demeanor, and gloves he never removed. The man in the gloves had to be connected. When we ran his description through old records, a name finally surfaced. Edward Blackwell, a recluse who had worked as a security guard at the gallery. He'd vanished shortly after Lily's disappearance. We tracked down his last known residence, an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The house was a monument to decay, its walls sagging and windows boarded up. Inside, the air was thick with dust and silence. In the basement, we found them, rows of black gloves neatly arranged on shelves, and in the center of the room, a faded photograph of Lily and Grace, their faces crossed out with jagged red lines. Edward Blackwell was never found, but the discovery of his lair reopened Lily's case. While we never learned what truly happened to her, the pieces finally fit together, and on my desk, a single black glove sits as a reminder. Being a 911 dispatcher is not a job for the faint of heart. It's a delicate balancing act between life and death, calm and chaos. For me, it was more than a job. It was a calling. I thrived on being the voice of reason in someone's worst moment. Until one night, a call shattered that confidence and left me haunted in ways I couldn't have imagined. The clock had just ticked past midnight, and the night shift had settled into its familiar rhythm. Most calls were routine: car accidents, noise complaints, an occasional domestic dispute. Then the phone rang again. 911, what's your emergency? At first, all I heard was static, followed by the faint sound of someone breathing heavily. Hello? Can you hear me? I pressed, my tone calm but firm. Yes, a woman's voice whispered. Her tone was shaky, almost fragile, like she was afraid to even speak. Ma'am, what's your name? There was a long pause. Rachel. Okay, Rachel. What's happening? She didn't answer right away, but I could hear her shuffling, like she was moving through a tight space. Then she whispered, He's here. Those two words sent a chill racing down my spine. I straightened in my chair, my senses on high alert. Who's there, Rachel? Is it someone you know? No, she replied, her voice cracking. He's inside. I signaled to my supervisor, motioning for them to trace the call. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. Rachel, where are you right now? Are you safe? I locked myself in the bathroom, she said, barely audible. But I don't think it's enough. Her words were clipped, filled with the kind of terror that made my skin crawl. I could hear faint sounds in the background, footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer. Stay on the line with me, I urged. Help is on the way. Just stay quiet and tell me what you see or hear. She started to cry softly, then stopped herself. He's at the door. I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the desk. Rachel, can you describe him? Anything at all? I haven't seen his face, she whispered. But he's wearing black, gloves. I don't know how he got in. Rachel, is there a window in the bathroom? Any way you can get out? No, she said, her voice trembling. I think he's listening. I gestured frantically to the team, hoping the trace would give us her location. Seconds felt like hours. Rachel, help is coming, I reassured her. Do you have anything in there to defend yourself? She hesitated. A toothbrush holder, a mirror shard. Good, I said, even though it felt useless. Stay as quiet as you can. Don't hang up. Then I heard it. A single resounding knock on the door. Rachel gasped. I could hear her breathing quicken, each breath sharper than the last. He's not saying anything, she murmured, just standing there. Then her voice changed, as if she were steeling herself. If this is it, you need to know something. What is it, Rachel? I asked, my own voice trembling now. Tell them, she started, but before she could finish, a deafening crash filled the line. Rachel! Rachel! I shouted, but the call went dead. The room felt eerily silent as I sat there, staring at the disconnected line. My supervisor approached, his face grim. "We traced the call. It's an address on Maplewood Drive. Units are en route." Maplewood Drive. The name felt familiar, but I couldn't place it. I stayed glued to my chair, listening to the updates from the responding officers. When they arrived, they found the house in disarray. The bathroom door had been smashed in, but Rachel was gone. All that remained was a single clue, a message scrawled on the fogged bathroom mirror. "Not him." I couldn't sleep that night. The words "not him" played over and over in my head. What did it mean? Who was she trying to warn us about? The next day, I dug into the address on Maplewood Drive. That's when I found it. A police report from 15 years ago. A woman named Emily Hayes had been murdered in that very house. Her case had gone cold, but the details were chillingly similar. A silent intruder, a locked bathroom, and a single cryptic clue left behind. Her final words: "He's not the one." The parallels were impossible to ignore. Two women, years apart, both leaving behind enigmatic messages. I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't random acts of violence. They were connected. I spent weeks poring over old records, trying to find any link between Rachel and Emily. There was nothing obvious, no shared friends, no common workplaces. But then I found something buried in a stack of archived news clippings. A photograph of Emily standing next to a man, Rachel's father. It all started to make sense. Rachel's father had been Emily's fiancé at the time of her murder. He'd been ruled out as a suspect, but what if the killer had targeted him through the people he loved? I contacted Detective Martin, who was now working the case. Together, we pieced together a chilling theory. The same person who killed Emily had returned for Rachel. But why? And who was the he Rachel and Emily were both so desperate to warn us about? One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph, Rachel and Emily, both smiling, with a man standing between them. It wasn't Rachel's father. It was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize. Written on the back were 3 words: "He's still watching." The case remains unsolved, but I can't shake the feeling that I'm now part of it. I see the man's face in my dreams, and sometimes late at night, I hear a faint knock at my door. And every time the phone rings, I wonder if it's another call that will leave me haunted forever. There's a strange kind of stillness that hangs over a crime scene after the initial chaos. The flashes of cameras, the murmurs of officers, the hum of forensic equipment, all fade into an eerie quiet. That's where I found myself one chilly October night, standing alone in the ruins of a life shattered by violence. The house on Maplewood Drive was a modest one, unassuming and quiet. The neighbors described the couple who lived there, Richard and Elaine Morgan, as friendly but private. Richard was dead now, found in the living room with a single bullet wound to the head. Elaine was missing. As a detective, I'd seen my share of tragedy, but something about this case felt off from the start. The scene was too neat, too calculated. And then there was the safe. It was a junior officer who found it, tucked behind a false panel in the floor of the study. The safe was small, black, and bolted securely into the wood. At first glance, it didn't seem out of place. People kept valuables in safes all the time. But when the officer called me over, his face pale, I knew this was no ordinary discovery. "There's something weird about it, Detective," he said, stepping aside to let me see. The safe was marked with deep scratches, as if someone had been desperate to open it. On the floor around it were faint smudges, like someone had knelt there for a long time. "Let's get it open," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. It took a while to crack the safe, and the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were prying into something that didn't want to be found. When the lock finally clicked, a cold draft seemed to seep from the opening, chilling me to the bone. Inside were several neatly stacked envelopes, a small leather-bound journal, and a USB drive. I pulled on gloves and carefully removed the items, laying them out on the desk. The envelopes were labeled with dates, each one spanning several years. The journal was filled with Richard's meticulous handwriting, and the USB drive had a single label scratched into its surface. For justice. I opened the first envelope, dated 10 years earlier. Inside was a letter written in Richard's hand, addressed to no one in particular. If you're reading this, then I am either dead or have failed to stop what is coming. The truth is darker than anyone could imagine, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to expose it. But be warned, once you know, there is no going back. My stomach tightened as I read the words. Each letter painted a clearer picture of a man consumed by fear and paranoia. He wrote about corruption, about hidden networks and unspeakable crimes. He hinted at names, powerful names, but never spelled them out. The journal was even more troubling. It was filled with diagrams, timelines, and coded messages. Richard had been tracking something, or someone, for years. Each entry was more frantic than the last, culminating in a final scrawled note. Elaine knows. She's part of it. If anything happens to me, don't trust her. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Elaine, the missing wife, was now more than just a potential victim. The USB drive contained a single video file, dated 2 days before Richard's death. I hesitated before playing it, knowing that whatever was on it could change everything I thought I knew about the case. The video was grainy, filmed in what looked like the study where I now stood. Richard appeared on screen, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow. "They're coming for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could stop them, but I was wrong. Elaine, she's been working with them all along. If you're watching this, don't try to find her. Don't try to stop them. Just run. The video confirmed my suspicions, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Who were they? What was Elaine's role in all of this? And what exactly had Richard uncovered that made him a target? I spent the next several days poring over the letters and journal entries, trying to piece together the puzzle. It became clear that Richard had stumbled upon something massive, a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of power. We traced Elaine's credit card to a motel on the outskirts of town. When we arrived, the room was empty, but it was clear she had been there. Among the scattered belongings was a single photo of her and Richard, torn in half. Scrawled on the back of the photo were the words, "It wasn't supposed to end this way." The motel manager told us she had left in a hurry, paying cash for a cab. The trail went cold after that, but something told me she wasn't gone for good. 2 weeks later, Elaine turned herself in. She walked into the station, calm and composed, and asked to speak to me. Her appearance was disheveled, her eyes bloodshot, but there was a determination in her expression that made me uneasy. "I didn't kill him," she said as soon as we were alone in the interrogation room. "But I knew it was going to happen. I tried to warn him, but he wouldn't listen." "Warn him about what?" I asked, leaning forward. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the one-way mirror. "They're everywhere," she said finally. "You think you're safe, but you're not. None of us are. Richard found out too much, and they silenced him. I'm next." Elaine refused to say more, and without concrete evidence, we couldn't hold her. She disappeared the next day, leaving behind only a cryptic note in her motel room. "The truth is in the safe. Don't let them win." The case was officially closed as a domestic dispute turned fatal, but I couldn't let it go. The contents of the safe haunted me, the evidence of a conspiracy that was too big for one man to uncover. Sometimes, late at night, I think about Elaine's warning, about Richard's final words, and I wonder if I'll be next, because some doors once opened can never be closed.